Racist cop pulls over elderly black woman, unaware she's a Supreme Court judge. He thought she was just an easy-to-bully old black woman he could insult at will. He handcuffed her right on the street and mocked her powerful badge as a fake. He had no idea that the woman he had just offended was Supreme Court Justice Theodora Marshall. A fatal mistake had ignited a confrontation that could shake the entire justice system. Let's see how a prejudiced gaze led to an inevitable downfall. The morning in Philadelphia possessed a rare tranquility. There were no sudden downpours, only a thin layer of mist gradually dissolving under the early morning sun. On Locust Street, the ancient trees and reddish-brown brick buildings were still deep in slumber. Justice Theodora Marshall's charcoal-gray Lexus ES glided along gently, silently, like a part of that stillness. She was on her way to the old bookstore on the corner, a habit that had become her morning ritual for years. It was how she brought order to a new day, in a world she knew all too well had a tendency toward chaos. She was neither hurried nor slow. Every movement she made, from the way she placed her hands on the steering wheel to her steady breathing, exuded the precision and composure of someone who had spent a lifetime weighing decisions that could change the fates of others. In a patrol car parked on a cross street, Officer Brody Kincaid saw the Lexus. He didn't notice the license plate or the speed. He noticed the driver, an elderly black woman sitting behind the wheel of a luxury car with a straight posture and a serene expression. She didn't look left or right. She just looked forward, as if this street and this entire city belonged to her. A feeling of discomfort rose in Kincaid's chest. It wasn't suspicion of a crime. It was an irritation, a feeling of his authority being challenged in an invisible way. He had seen that look before, the confident, intelligent look that educated black people often carried, as if they believed they were on par with the law, or even above it. "Who does she think she is, with that look on her face?" Kincaid muttered to himself. He didn't need a reason. Her existence on this street, in this car, with this demeanor, was reason enough. He flipped on his lights. The flashing red and blue lights abruptly shattered the morning's peace, reflecting in the Lexus's rearview mirror. Theodora Marshall glanced at it, her eyes showing no surprise or fear, only a flicker of weariness. She was all too familiar with this. She slowly turned on her signal and pulled over to the curb perfectly. Her movements were so smooth and precise that it only angered Kincaid more. He got out of his car, his heavy footsteps on the pavement seeming to assert his authority. He stopped by her car window and knocked 3 curt times with his knuckles. Mrs. Marshall slowly lowered the window, just enough for them to speak. "License and registration," Kincaid commanded, without a word of greeting. "Good morning, officer," Mrs. Marshall replied, her voice low and clear. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The calmness in her question was like adding fuel to the fire. To Kincaid, this was a challenge. "The reason is because I told you to. Hand over the documents." Mrs. Marshall remained silent for a moment, then slowly opened her handbag. She handed him the car's documents. As Kincaid looked them over, he searched for an excuse. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" "I'm on my way to the bookstore," she replied. "The bookstore?" Kincaid scoffed. "You don't look like the type to be here to read books." Mrs. Marshall looked him straight in the eye. "Then what type of person do I look like to you, Officer Kincaid?" She had read the name on his nameplate. The direct question made Kincaid freeze. He felt attacked, insecure. He had to regain control. "Step out of the car," he ordered. "I need to search the vehicle." "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice still even. "On the grounds that I suspect you're hiding something," Kincaid growled. He could no longer stand this composure. Mrs. Marshall looked at him, a deep look, not of anger, but of disappointment. She slowly opened the car door and stepped out. maintaining her straight, dignified posture. Kincaid gestured for her to place her hands on the hood of the car. Then he bent down, reaching into the handbag she had left on the seat. He pulled out a wallet, a notebook, a fountain pen. Nothing illegal. Disappointment was clear on his face. Then his hand touched a metal object, wrapped in a small leather case. He pulled it out. It was a golden badge, with the seal of the Supreme Court of the United States in the center. The engraving on it was clear. Theodora Marshall, Associate Justice. Kincaid froze. He stared at the badge, then looked up at the woman standing before him. A contemptuous and smug smile spread across his lips. He thought he had caught a fraud in the act. A Supreme Court justice? He laughed out loud. You? That's a good one. And then, in an act of absolute contempt, Brody Kincaid threw the badge onto the damp pavement. It made a piercing clang in the quiet morning. "You're under arrest," Kincaid declared, his voice full of satisfaction, "for impersonating a federal officer." He pulled out his handcuffs. As the cold metal tightened around Mrs. Marshall's wrists, a few passers-by had stopped, the first cell phones beginning to rise. Theodora Marshall did not resist. She just looked at the police officer before her, and in her eyes, he didn't see fear. He saw a silent judgment. Brody Kincaid thought he had just asserted his power. He didn't know that he had just ignited his own downfall and challenged an entire legal system. The patrol car door slammed shut, trapping Justice Theodora Marshall in a cramped space of plastic and steel. From the driver's seat, Officer Brody Kincaid glanced at her in the rearview mirror with a self-satisfied look. "The act is over, lady," he let out a comment, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "At the station, we have plenty of ways to verify if someone is a judge or not." Mrs. Marshall did not respond. She looked out the window, the city of Philadelphia blurring past like streaks of color. She wasn't thinking about Kincaid's words. She was thinking about the legal system of which he was a product, a system that had allowed ignorance and prejudice to be armed with a gun and authority. Her silence was not acceptance, but the observation of an expert diagnosing a metastasized disease. Meanwhile, the outside world had begun to move. The first video, shot on a shaky phone by a college student, appeared on a neighborhood community page. It was only 47 seconds long, but it contained everything. It showed Kincaid's arrogant attitude, Mrs. Marshall's calm demeanor, and the unforgivable moment he threw the golden badge to the ground. That image, more than any words, ignited a firestorm. Within an hour, the video had been shared thousands of times. The hashtag # Justice for Judge Marshall started trending on Twitter. At first, it was just angry comments. But then, the professionals began to weigh in. In the library of Penn Law School, a group of students was studying when one let out a small gasp. The group huddled around a laptop, staring in horror at the screen. "No way," a girl whispered. That's Justice Marshall, our professor." They didn't just see an unjust arrest. They saw their teacher, their mentor, being humiliated. Immediately, a private group chat was created, with a single goal: find out everything about Officer Brody Kincaid. A few blocks away, in a luxurious office overlooking the city square, top civil rights attorney Amelia Vance was on the phone when her assistant rushed in, holding a tablet. Amelia watched the video, her face hardening. She didn't look shocked. She looked weary and angry, like a doctor seeing the symptoms of an old disease recurring. "Cancel my 11 o'clock meeting," she said into the phone, "and get me the director of the ACLU. It's happening again." At the same time, in a quiet house in the suburbs, a retired federal judge, an old friend of Theodora's, was watching the morning news. When Mrs. Marshall's image appeared on the screen, he nearly dropped his teacup. He didn't call the press. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, a private line to a powerful figure in the Department of Justice. "I need a favor," he said, his voice low and firm. It's about Theodora Marshall. Back at the police station, Brody Kincaid was writing his report, embellishing the story of an uncooperative and suspicious subject. His superior, a lieutenant, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, Kincaid. Just follow procedure. This online noise will blow over soon enough." They were confident they had the situation under control. They thought they were putting out a small fire. They were completely unaware that outside the walls of the police station, 3 undercurrents, academic, legal, and federal, had just been activated by one woman's silence. And that tsunami was on its way. While Brody Kincaid was still preening over his report, the wheels of justice, though slow, had begun to turn unstoppably. At the Penn Law Library, it was late, but no one was sleeping. The group of students, fueled by coffee and righteous indignation, had split up to scour the city's public databases. And then, a student named Leo cried out, his voice filled with astonishment. "I found it." On his screen was a spreadsheet. 15. That was the number of official complaints filed against Officer Brody Kincaid in the past 10 years. All the victims were people of color, and every single complaint, without exception, was closed with the same phrase: insufficient evidence to proceed. This was no longer an isolated incident. This was a pattern. They had the data. Simultaneously, at Amelia Vance's law firm, a strategy meeting was underway. Amelia had managed to contact 3 of Kincaid's 15 previous victims, people who had once been intimidated, dismissed, and forced into silence. But when they saw the image of Justice Theodora Marshall in handcuffs, their courage was rekindled. "This is no longer just about Justice Marshall," Amelia told her team, her voice firm. "This is a potential class action lawsuit. We won't just be suing one officer. We will be suing this entire department's corrupt way of operating." Meanwhile, the news of Theodora Marshall's true identity had hit the highest levels of Philadelphia's city government, like an earthquake. At City Hall, the mayor and the police chief were in an emergency meeting. The initial confidence had vanished, replaced by absolute panic. "A sitting Supreme Court justice?" the police chief roared, crumpling a piece of paper in his hand. "You're telling me Kincaid arrested a Supreme Court justice and threw her badge on the ground?" The conversation was no longer about procedure or misunderstandings. It was about how to contain a federal-level disaster. The blame game began, and at the police station, the young officer who had been with Kincaid was sitting in a small interrogation room, facing 2 detectives from the Internal Affairs Division. The air was thick with tension. They were pressuring him, suggesting he should state that Mrs. Marshall had been provocative or uncooperative. "You just need to confirm Kincaid's report, and it's over." "You have a whole career ahead of you," one detective said. The young officer was sweating. He remembered Mrs. Marshall's calm eyes and the contempt in Kincaid's voice. He was standing at a crossroads between his career and his conscience. But the biggest crack didn't come from high-level meetings or coerced testimonies. It came from a place no one expected. In the police department's records room, a desk sergeant, a man who had worked there for 30 years and was tired of seeing men like Kincaid get away with everything, made a decision. He had seen too many complaints, lost, too much evidence, processed. That night, he quietly printed out a report from 2 years prior. It was a complaint from a black pastor who had been pulled from his car and humiliated by Kincaid for looking suspicious. This complaint had been dismissed and buried by Kincaid's superior. The old sergeant put the report in a plain brown envelope with no return address. The next morning, that envelope was sitting on the desk of a veteran investigative reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And by noon, a massive headline appeared on the front page of the digital edition. Leaked report. Philadelphia PD ignored previous complaint against officer in justice's arrest. The story was no longer just a viral video. It had become a scandal with documented evidence of a cover-up. The cracks were no longer faint lines. The wall of silence had begun to crumble. The leaked report was an earthquake, but the strongest aftershock came from a direction no one anticipated. David Chen, the veteran journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, wasn't satisfied with just publishing the leaked document. He wanted to know more about the man, Brody Kincaid. He began to dig into the officer's past, combing through old city archives, local articles, and school announcements. And then, in a faded edition of a community newspaper from 15 years ago, David found it. A small black-and-white photograph. In it was a teenage Brody Kincaid, awkward in a borrowed suit, shaking hands with a city representative. The caption below read, "Brody Kincaid, one of this year's recipients of the Marshall Legal Opportunity Scholarship Fund, established to support underprivileged youth pursuing careers in law and law enforcement." David Chen's heart seemed to stop. Marshall. He frantically double-checked the information on the scholarship fund. The founder and primary benefactor was none other than Justice Theodora Marshall. His next exclusive article wasn't just news, it was a bombshell. Exclusive. Officer who arrested Justice was a former recipient of scholarship she founded. If the previous story had caused a storm, this one created a hurricane. It was no longer simply a case of abuse of power or racial discrimination. It had become a tragedy of betrayal, a parable of kindness repaid with contempt. Public opinion boiled over. Punditry shows across the nation analyzed this detail relentlessly. "He didn't just bite the hand that fed him," one commentator said. "He tried to devour it." The story had touched a deeper level of outrage. It posed a painful question. How could someone who had been given a second chance by this very woman treat her with such cruelty and prejudice? The answer, though unspoken, seemed all too clear. Kincaid's insecurity in the face of a powerful, intelligent black woman had overcome any sense of gratitude. Her past kindness only made her present composure a greater threat in his eyes. This time, reporters didn't just surround the police station. They camped outside Justice Marshall's old brick house. They shouted questions as she walked to her car each morning. "Justice Marshall, how do you feel about this revelation? Do you regret helping him?" But Theodora Marshall maintained her silence. Her office issued only a single statement, a mere sentence. Justice Marshall will not comment on matters related to her personal philanthropy. Her focus remains on the integrity of the legal process. That silence, that refusal to turn the story into a personal drama, only enhanced her stature. She didn't allow herself to become a pitiable victim. She forced all attention back to the core issue, Kincaid's actions and the failure of the system that had enabled him. Meanwhile, Brody Kincaid was completely silent. He made no public appearances. The detail about the scholarship was a blow he could not defend against. What could have been the redemption story of his life had now become evidence of his ingratitude, the greatest stain in his downfall. The entire city of Philadelphia seemed to be holding its breath. The upcoming public hearing was no longer just about a traffic stop. It was now about everything: race, power, gratitude, betrayal, and the fundamental question of a community's soul. And the anticipation to hear Justice Theodora Marshall, who had been silent for so long, finally speak, had reached a fever pitch. The Philadelphia City Council hearing room was packed. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't a trial, but everyone present, from journalists and lawyers to ordinary citizens, understood that the judgment rendered today would carry more weight than any court sentence. Officer Brody Kincaid sat in the front row with his lawyer, his face taut, his eyes glinting with stubborn defiance. He had been instructed to remain silent and let the city's attorney handle it. Across from them, representatives for the police department and the city looked visibly nervous. And then, Justice Theodora Marshall entered. She wasn't flanked by a large legal team. She was alone, dressed in a simple, professional suit. But as she walked in, the entire room seemed to fall silent for a beat. Her presence carried an invisible weight, an authority that came not from a title, but from dignity. The hearing began. The city's attorney gave a long-winded speech filled with bureaucratic jargon. He acknowledged procedural errors, regretted the unfortunate misunderstandings, and promised to review internal policies. It was a weak attempt to turn a scandal of discrimination into an administrative issue. Then it was Mrs. Marshall's turn. Her name was called. She slowly approached the lectern, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the counsel. Her eyes held no anger, only a terrifying clarity. "My name is Theodora Marshall," she began, her voice resonating through the room. "On the morning of April 24th, I was arrested by Officer Brody Kincaid on Locust Street." She paused, letting the statement sink in. The room held its breath, expecting an emotional account of the humiliation she had endured. But she didn't give them that. "However," she continued, "I am not here today to speak about my personal experience. My experience, while unfortunate, is merely a symptom of a much more serious disease. I am here today to talk about the 14 other complaints that have been filed against this officer over the past decade." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Kincaid's lawyer flinched. Mrs. Marshall continued, her voice steady and factual, as if reading an indictment. "I am here to talk about Mr. Henderson, who was pulled from his car and searched for playing his music too loud. I am here to talk about Ms. Davis, who was threatened after daring to ask why she was being stopped. I am here to talk about the teenager Jamal, whose record was stained for having an uncooperative attitude. What do they all have in common? They are all people of color, and none of them had a Supreme Court badge in their handbag to make their story heard." She turned a page of her document. "I am also here to talk about the Marshall Legal Opportunity Fund, a fund I personally established to give a second chance to at-risk youth. Officer Kincaid was once a recipient of that scholarship." The room erupted. The detail was beyond belief. "The system, and I myself, invested in this officer's future," she said, her gaze now fixed directly on a stunned Kincaid. "The system had a responsibility to ensure that investment was not corrupted. The system failed." She didn't raise her voice. She showed no emotion. She simply presented the facts, arranging them with a logic as cold as steel. She had transformed her personal case into irrefutable proof of a pattern of abuse and a systemic failure. She concluded her speech by looking directly at the council chairman. "The question before you today is not whether Officer Kincaid made a mistake. The question is why a system designed to protect citizens spent 10 years protecting one officer from its citizens. I rest my case." She sat down. Silence enveloped the room, a heavy, stunned silence. In that moment, everyone understood. They were not witnessing a victim seeking sympathy. They were witnessing a Supreme Court justice, even when not on her bench, delivering justice. Every excuse about procedural errors had utterly collapsed. After Justice Marshall's speech, a heavy silence hung in the room. Brody Kincaid's lawyer stood up, looking visibly flustered. He tried to rebut, to salvage the situation. "Honorable council members," he began, "these are all old, unfounded complaints that were reviewed and dismissed. Bringing them up here is an attempt to tarnish the reputation of a dedicated officer." "Counselor," Justice Marshall interrupted, her voice no louder, but carrying a weight that silenced him. "Are you suggesting that 15 different citizens, over 10 years, coincidentally fabricated similar stories? Or are you suggesting that the system was wrong 15 consecutive times when it dismissed them?" There was no answer to that question. Every attempt at a defense became meaningless against her sharp logic. The council chairman cleared his throat, turning a page. The council would like to call Officer Michael Jensen to speak. Officer Jensen, you were with Officer Kincaid on the morning in question, correct? All eyes turned to the young police officer. He looked pale and frightened. As he walked to the witness stand, he didn't dare look at Brody Kincaid, who was glaring at him with daggers in his eyes. Officer Jensen, the chairman asked, did you observe any traffic violation that led to the stop of Justice Marshall's vehicle? Jensen hesitated, wringing his hands. The entire room held its breath. No, sir, he finally mumbled. And did you witness Officer Kincaid throw the justice's badge on the ground? Another pause. Jensen glanced quickly at Kincaid, then stared at the floor. Yes, sir. And in your professional opinion, the chairman asked the decisive question, was Officer Kincaid's use of force and subsequent arrest justified? This was the moment of truth. Brody Kincaid gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw twitching. The young officer took a deep breath, as if facing the choice of a lifetime. He lifted his head, not looking at Kincaid, but directly at Justice Marshall. In her eyes, he saw no threat, only truth. No, sir, Jensen said, his voice quiet but clear. It was not justified. He was angry. Angry that she wasn't afraid of him. That confession was like a verdict. It confirmed everything Marshall had implied. And that's when Brody Kincaid broke. Traitor, he roared, jumping up from his seat, pointing at Jensen. You weak-kneed rookie, what do you know? His lawyer tried to pull him back down, but it was too late. Kincaid had lost all control. He spun around, unleashing his rage on everyone. This is a witch hunt, all of you, with your high and mighty words and your smug looks, he screamed, his face beet red. She thought she was better than me from the moment I saw her. People like her always think the rules don't apply to them. He had, on his own, ripped off the mask of procedural compliance. In front of the entire world, on live television, he exposed the full extent of the insecurity, resentment, and prejudice that had driven his actions. He was no longer defending a mistake. He was confessing his character. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but Kincaid's shouts echoed through the room. The cameras didn't miss a second, capturing the image of a man being consumed by his own hatred. In that moment, the hearing was unofficially over. Brody Kincaid had condemned himself with his own words. Brody Kincaid's outburst extinguished any final effort to salvage the situation. The council chairman's gavel fell, ending the hearing in chaos. The council will forward the entire record and findings from today to the district attorney's office and the Department of Justice for consideration of criminal charges. It was an unofficial sentence, but more powerful than any verdict. Brody Kincaid's fate was sealed, not by a jury, but by his own hateful words broadcast to millions. The fallout came as fast as a storm. Less than 3 hours later, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office held an emergency press conference. Before a forest of cameras, the DA announced, Officer Brody Kincaid will be prosecuted on charges of abuse of power, official oppression, and filing a false report. He has been suspended immediately and without pay. The legal machine, normally slow and bureaucratic, was now operating at lightning speed under the watchful eye of the nation. That afternoon, the city's mayor and police chief, the two most powerful men in Philadelphia, stood at another press conference podium. Their faces looked weary and defeated. They read from a prepared statement, the words carefully vetted by lawyers. On behalf of the city of Philadelphia and the police department, the mayor began, we wish to extend our sincerest and deepest apologies to Justice Theodora Marshall for the regrettable incident that occurred. There is no excuse for Officer Kincaid's behavior. We commend Justice Marshall's dignity and restraint, and we are committed to conducting a full and transparent investigation. It was a public humbling, an admission of failure. But Justice Marshall wasn't there to hear it. She did not appear on television, nor did she grant interviews. Instead, a brief statement was issued from her office. Its content was more powerful than any speech. I acknowledge and accept the apology from the mayor's office and the police department. However, an apology for an outcome does not address the culture that created it. True accountability will not be measured in words, but in actions. It will be measured by reforming training protocols, by strengthening civilian oversight, and by dismantling the blue wall of silence that protected Officer Kincaid for a decade. My focus now is on ensuring this moment becomes a catalyst for real and lasting change, so that no other citizen of Philadelphia has to rely on a Supreme Court badge to be treated with basic human dignity. That statement reshaped the entire debate. She had turned her personal victory into a demand for collective responsibility. Meanwhile, the ripples continued to spread. The young officer, Michael Jensen, was placed on administrative leave for his own safety after his testimony. His name was cursed by some in the police force and hailed as heroic by civil rights organizations. The lieutenant who had repeatedly cleared Kincaid's complaints was also suspended pending investigation. The dominoes had begun to fall. The immediate battle was won, and a conviction for Kincaid was all but certain. But in her quiet office, Theodora Marshall wasn't watching news reports of her victory. She was looking at a blank sheet of paper where she began to sketch out the first ideas for a new, citizen-led police oversight commission. The real work was just beginning. The verdict was in for Brody Kincaid, but the story didn't end there. In fact, that was only the beginning. The case of Justice Theodora Marshall didn't just bring down a corrupt officer. It became a catalyst, forcing an entire city to confront truths it had willfully ignored for decades. At Penn Law School, the Marshall case was quickly incorporated into the curriculum. It wasn't taught as a criminal case, but as a classic lesson in legal strategy and civic ethics. Professors analyzed her strategic silence as a tool more powerful than any eloquent argument. Students weren't just learning about the law, they were learning about courage. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia Police Academy was undergoing a profound overhaul. A new mandatory module was designed, titled De-escalation and Implicit Bias Training. Its central case study was reconstructed from the very video taken on Locust Street. Cadets were put in Kincaid's position and required to identify the points where the incident could have gone differently. The goal was not to punish, but to ensure another Brody Kincaid would never wear the uniform. And Justice Marshall herself, who had never sought the spotlight, now found herself at the center of change. She declined all invitations to join official committees, but accepted an offer to advise the law student group that had helped her. Under her guidance, they founded the Locust Street Project, a nonprofit dedicated to helping citizens properly document and file complaints, turning individual grievances into data sets that could prove patterns of misconduct. The Marshall Legal Opportunity Fund also received an unprecedented wave of donations, but this time, she added a new clause for its recipients. Each year, they had to complete 50 hours of community service in police monitoring programs. She didn't just give them an opportunity, she gave them a responsibility. One afternoon, while sitting in her chambers, she received a letter. It wasn't from a lawyer or a politician. It was from Michael Jensen, the young officer who had testified. He wrote that he had transferred to a different unit and was taking evening classes in criminal justice. "You didn't just save me from a wrongful order," he wrote. "You showed me the kind of law enforcement officer I want to become." Theodora Marshall folded the letter, a warm feeling spreading through her. She looked out the window. She had never wanted to be a symbol, but she understood that a person's legacy isn't what they say about themselves, but the actions they inspire in others. Her silence on that fateful morning now echoed in thousands of other voices. Voices demanding transparency, accountability, and justice. It was a legacy far greater than any verdict. Months had passed. Autumn brought a crisp, cool air to Philadelphia. On a Tuesday morning, Justice Theodora Marshall was again driving her charcoal gray Lexus down the familiar road. It was still Locust Street, still the same old brownstone buildings, but everything felt different. She no longer felt that invisible tension in the air. She drove, not as someone silently observing, but simply as a woman enjoying a peaceful morning. As she stopped at a red light, a Philadelphia police patrol car slowly pulled up and stopped in the lane beside her. For a moment, an unconscious reflex made her muscles tense slightly, a residue of memory. The officer in the passenger seat, a young woman, turned and looked at her. Their eyes met. The officer recognized her immediately. There was no suspicion, no challenge in her gaze. Instead, she gave a slight, formal nod, a gesture of sincere respect. Justice Marshall nodded back, a rare, faint smile gracing her lips. The light turned green. The two cars slowly moved forward, turning in different directions. Not a word was spoken, but a profound message had been conveyed. A change, however small, had truly taken place on this very street. She parked her car and stepped into the old bookstore. The wind chime on the door tinkled familiarly. The owner, a middle-aged Asian man, looked up from behind the counter, smiling brightly. "Good morning, Justice Marshall. It's an honor to have you." His greeting now carried a special warmth and respect. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," she replied. As she browsed the shelves, Mr. Chen approached and said softly, "My son came home and told me they're learning about you in school. He said now he understands what real courage means." Theodora Marshall paused, looking at the man before her, and in that moment, she saw the true impact of the journey she had been on. It wasn't in the headlines or the administrative reforms. It was here. When Theodora Marshall left the bookstore, she placed her book and her cooled cup of tea on the passenger seat. She didn't drive straight home. Instead, she took a short walk, breathing in the fresh Philadelphia air. As she passed a coffee shop, she noticed a young woman wiping a table. Pinned to her collar was a small, crudely hand-carved wooden pin. She couldn't make out its shape, but it caught her attention. A few minutes later, passing a park, she saw a college student sitting on a bench, reading. On his backpack, there was a similar wooden pin. This time, she got a better look. It wasn't a political symbol or a brand logo. It was simply the image of the scales of justice. These pins had started appearing all over the city in the past few months. A quiet movement, with no leader, no noisy marches. It was the community's response to her story. Each pin was a silent promise. We saw, we will not forget, and we will not bow. In the car on the way home, Mrs. Marshall reflected on the journey. Brody Kincaid was in prison. Reforms were underway. But her real victory wasn't in those things. It was in those small wooden pins. It was in the respectful gaze of the young police officer, in the lesson of the bookstore owner's son, in the shift in consciousness of an entire community. She had never sought to be a symbol. She had simply refused to let others define her worth. She didn't fight by screaming. She won by not bowing down. And in doing so, she had taught an entire city how to stand up straight. True justice, she realized, isn't punishment. It's prevention. It's building a society where kindness is not seen as weakness, and dignity doesn't require a title to be recognized. Her Lexus continued to glide smoothly. The Philadelphia sky was clear blue. A new dawn had truly begun. The story of Justice Theodora Marshall proved one thing. Dignity is the most powerful weapon, and the right kind of silence can echo louder than any shout. She didn't need to slam her fist or raise her voice. She just needed to stand firm in her truth, and an entire system had to look at itself in the mirror. Have you ever felt too small to make a difference? Remember, sometimes just keeping your back straight is enough to inspire an entire community. If this story touched you, please share it to spread the message of quiet courage. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to follow more meaningful journeys where justice is served not by power, but by the strength of human dignity itself.